Okay, guys, so today we are going to continue our lecture on error analysis. And yesterday we did some introduction of what actually error analysis is, what kind of methodology is it, and uh, basically we focused on coders' suggestion of some of the steps towards error analysis. And other than that, we talked about how error analysis is a part of applied linguistics and why uh, analyzing learners' error is important to improve pedagogy, specifically language pedagogy. So today we are going to look at the second step, which is identification of errors. As for the first step, we talked about collection of sample of learners' error, and we also came to know about how to collect how to collect data from the sample and what are the different kinds of samples according to the size from which we can collect corpus or data for our analysis, right? And we also talked about cross-sectional and longitudinal studies related to the time period of data collection. So today we are going to do, once the data is collected, how would you identify the errors, right? So once you have the corpus with you of learner's language, then the errors in the corpus have to be identified, okay? Before we can describe them, it is important to find out whether what we are pointing out or what we are trying to analyze are actually errors or not, right? So first of all, let's try to define what are errors, okay? So language errors or errors in language, speech or writing, or in the production of language, are defined as deviation from the norm. So whatever deviation we find, it can be a grammatical deviation, it can be syntactic deviation, it can be lexical deviation, it can be phonological deviation from the norm. So that can be defined as errors, all these deviations. But then when we say that errors are deviation from the norm, there are certain questions related to what is the norm, okay? What should be followed and what is called a norm. So which variety of the target language should serve as a norm, specifically when it comes to speaking, because now we have a concept of world Englishes and all kind of accents are quite acceptable, okay? It is easier to find out these deviation from the norm in written corpus or the data that is collected from writing, okay? Composition writing or translation or anything, right? But because in writing we have a standard format or standard English to follow, and much of the time there is an agreement on grammatical rules as well when it comes to writing. But when it comes to speaking, of course, for speaking also, we have standard English. But then other varieties, because of globalization, because of the existence of the concept of world Englishes, so many accents are acceptable now. So that becomes really difficult to find out if the student has committed an error, specifically in pronunciation, right? So, the first question that we need to sort out is to make certain rubrics about which variety of the dark language are we following. And from there, we can define the deviation from the norm. Another question that may pop up while you are trying to identify the errors is the distinction between error and mistake. Error and mistake are not similar, right? And error analysis is about analyzing errors only and not mistakes, according to Corder. So when we say that errors and mistakes are different things, and our concern should be errors, not mistake. So it is very important to know what's the difference, right? In order to know the difference between error and mistake, we should know the difference between competence and performance, right? I don't know if you know the definitions or if you have any idea. These are terms from psycholinguistics or second language acquisition. If you have done those subjects, it would be easier for you to understand the difference between error and mistake. But for now, if I quickly define and differentiate comprehension and performance for you, language comprehension, not comprehension, but competence, sorry. Language competence means the total knowledge of the language that you have, okay? And performance comes from competence, right? Performance is the actual use of language, okay? So if your competence is larger, that is your language knowledge, the actual language knowledge or your total language knowledge in your mind is larger, chances are that you will perform better, okay? You will produce the language better. Your performance relies on your competence, okay? So understanding the difference between competence and performance, now we can differentiate between error and mistake. Now, error is a deviation due to lack of knowledge, okay? That means, in other words, error is the deviation due to lack of competence, because we have said that competence is the knowledge of the language, the overall knowledge of the language, okay, or the total knowledge that you have about the language, right? So you would commit errors, or a language learner would commit errors if he lacks competence, okay? He does not know it at all. It isn't that he has the knowledge and he's unable to perform. In that case, if he has the competence and he has the knowledge and he has learned the language, and it's a part of his schema also, but he is unable to perform for a certain reason, right? So this is a failure to perform their competence, and this failure is called as mistake. So when a learner fails to perform his competence, that is a mistake, right? That means he has the knowledge, he learned it as far as second language learning is concerned, but he's unable to make use of his learning at the right time for any reason. Maybe he has some processing problem that does not let him access his knowledge, and he is falling back on some alternative non-standard rule that he finds easier to access at the time of using the language. Okay, maybe later on he can perform well, but at the time when it comes to using the language or using particular structure, vocabulary item, some lexical item, or any aspect of language, um, he cannot access the storehouse of knowledge of the language. That is, he fails to access his competence. So that is a mistake, and that is not an error. Okay, he does not need any help in correcting the mistake. He will self-correct it because he has the knowledge and he understands that he has committed a mistake. But a learner who is making errors needs help of the teacher, because that part of the language where he is making errors isn't in his competence, and he needs to be taught. He needs to be corrected, he needs to be taught, and it's a concern of the language teacher. Okay, so Corder, as I told you, he argues that error analysis should be restricted to the study of errors and not mistakes. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do with the corpus, that is the data you have collected from the language learners, is to differentiate between the deviations. Okay, so deviations can be of two kinds. Those can be errors and those can be mistakes. Once you successfully identify the errors of the students, only then you would be able to address the problem through error analysis. Okay, through this identification process, one should be able to eliminate the mistakes, because we are not going to go further with these mistakes in the process of error analysis. Okay. Now, the third question that needs to be answered while we are trying to identify the errors is whether the errors are overt or those are covert, right? Now, overt errors are easy to understand. Those are very much visible to the teacher, okay? Whereas the covert errors are maybe superficially well-formed, but what happens is they lack appropriateness. They do not give the intended meaning of the learners, okay? So those are covert errors because apparently they would look correct, but later on, while you are reading the rest of the text that is produced by the learner, you will find out that he fails to give his intended meaning. He fails to get his message across. Okay, so there is an example of this covert error here. You know, when a student say it was stopped, right? That's fine. Yeah, there's no problem with the structure. But what about if it's the wind? Wind was stopped. Now, the structure is fine, but the sentence isn't really appropriate, right? Because wind cannot be stopped. Okay. Otherwise, it was stopped. Anything, you know, the car was stopped. The person was stopped, right? So superficially, that sounds correct when you listen to it or when you read it, but when you go further and find out that what it refers to, then it happens to be a problem. Okay. The fourth question that we can consider while we are identifying errors is whether analysis should consider deviation incorrectness, or also deviation of appropriateness. Okay. Now, correctness refers to the rules of language or the rules of usage, like the grammatical rules, right? Like the syntactic rules. Okay. And those are very much visible also. So deviation, incorrectness is easy to find out, as you know, as we have seen in the overt kind of an error. But when it is a deviation from appropriateness, that is, rules of language use are violated, or the context has not been uh, properly considered, and something is written out of context or something is said out of context, then should those errors be also analyzed? So there can be different kind of deviations from the norm are not just straightforward phenomena. It has to do a lot with over and above the language, right? So, you know, how to limit our error analysis, what we are considering as deviation needs to be identified first, right? And it so happens that much of the time error analysis attends to the breaches of the code, that is, it works with the deviation in the rules of the usage or the grammatical rules of the language, rather than misuse of the code, or the appropriateness of the language or the rules of language use. So much of the time error analysis works with the usage rather than the actual use of the language, right? And there are a number of reasons also, because the deviations from the rules of the language are easily visible. But a deeper analysis might have to be done to look at the deviation from rules of language use or the misuse of the court. Okay. So what's the solution to these questions? Coda introduces another term of interpretations within identification of errors, right? So here, when there's a difference between errors and mistakes, and we have to work with the errors alone. We need to eliminate the mistakes from the corpus that we have collected. Then there are issues of overt and covert errors, and then there is rules of usage and rules of use, deviations in both, deviation in one. So in order to answer these questions, Quarter says that interpretation at this stage becomes important. And he says that it can be of three kinds. A normal kind of interpretation, when meaning can be assigned to an utterance on the basis of rules of the target language, right? And then there is authoritative kind of interpretation if the producer of the language or the language learner is available to you, and you can ask his intended meaning, what the utterance means, and you can reconstruct it and then find out the error. And then there is a plausible kind of an interpretation, and by referring to the context and by translating what the person has said or written in his first language, and then interpreting whether the intended meaning or can be got across, right? So it's just not over and done with identification, but identification is a little complicated because difference between error and mistake, overt and covert errors, and then usage and use of the language, intended meaning, gets in. So it's important that another process of interpretation should take place before we can identify exactly if we are working with the errors only, and not with the mistakes or with other things that might be present in the corpus, right? So there are three kinds of interpretations: normal, authoritative, and plausible, right? Normal is when you can see the deviation from the rules and you're trying to make out the meaning according to the rules in the target language. Okay, and from this distinction between three kinds of interpretation, we also come to know that what is important in error analysis is to find out if the meaning is getting cross. Okay, and similarly, the second kind of interpretation is authoritative, and there, if you are unable to get the meaning, get the intended meaning, then you may ask the producer of the language. Okay, and if his intended meaning matches with what you interpret, then it's not an error. But what he has written and he's saying something else, he wanted to write something else, but because of lack of knowledge of some structures or lack of knowledge of the vocabulary, he has written something else which he never intended to. So through authoritative interpretation, you may find that out. Other than that, the third kind of interpretation is the plausible interpretation. And here you have to refer to the context. If you are unable to get the meaning of what the writer or the speaker has written, so you need to contextualize it as well, whether in that context the person has committed an error or it's not an error and his intended meaning are getting across, right? So coming to the third step in error analysis research, after collection of sample of learners' language and identification of errors, we are coming to the description of errors. Okay, let's come to the description of errors. Now, once you have collected the data and then you have separated the errors by identifying them, and then we come to the third step of description of errors. Now, when it comes to description of errors, we have some of the researchers. You have been, sometime you are acquainted with these in applied linguistics. Also, for instance, Krushin and Dewey and Burt. They have given certain taxonomies in order to describe errors. Okay, so the simplest of the taxonomy is based on some linguistic categories, right? Now, some general linguistic categories are like clauses, auxiliary system, passive sentences, temporal conjunctions, sentential complements, questions, negatives, under and overuse. So then there can be subcategories also. For instance, auxiliaries can have subcategories of do, have, be, right? Now, what exactly is description of errors is finding out some rubrics. How would you describe the errors? And different, when we say that there are taxonomies available, which different researchers have given, by that we mean that they have given certain rubrics, okay, how errors can be described. Otherwise, it would be difficult to limit the description of errors, and the research would be kind of haphazard and without boundaries, which a good research shouldn't be, right? So there are different taxonomies available, and if you give this section a reading, I'll be talking about some of the taxonomies. Otherwise, there are a number of taxonomies, because whosoever has worked in the field of error analysis has come across different kind of errors. People or researchers' context for error analysis is different. Okay. And we would see in limitation of error analysis, or while we will be doing evaluation of errors, we would see that how different the context becomes of these error analysts, and what are the factors that different error analysis analysts would face, and the factors that can impact their data and the analysis as well. So while we are doing these description of errors, we would be talking about some of the taxonomies. As I have told you, that the simplest one is the taxonomy of linguistic categories. Okay, the researcher makes certain categories, and whenever he identifies an error, he puts it in one category or the other category according to the nature of the error, right? And then these categories also have subcategories. Now, Politzer and Rose in 1973, they gave more general categories, more broader categories, I would say, like morphology, syntax, and vocabulary. Okay. So if there were errors in the morpheme, they would put it in the category of morphology. If there was a problem with the structure of the sentence, they would put that error in the syntactic category. If some word is incorrectly used, they would put it in the category of vocabulary. So they worked with the broader categories, while these linguists, Dewey, Bird, Krushen, they work with they work with a little detailed categories, and then they made subcategories. So it really depends on the corpus that you have selected and on the taxonomy that you are using. So in description of errors, then we give a detailed description of these errors that we have collected through the use of taxonomies. And then we can even quantify the corpus. Now, what is this quantification of the corpus is, you try to count the number of errors in one category and the number of errors in another category, so as to find out where is the problem area for the students, where are they committing more errors. Okay. Theoretically speaking, it can help the teacher work better in the classrooms, but if we read error analysis research in detail, quantification of corpus of errors did not prove to be of much use. Okay, but for now, you just need to know that there is a process through which errors can be quantified. Okay, and by quantification of corpus of errors, we mean that through certain softwares, you can count the errors in a particular category while you are using a specific taxonomy, right? There has been a lot of research, and for instance, previously, and the most popular belief in error analysis is the phenomena of interference from the first language, that most of the errors, while people quantify the error corpus, they found out that most of the errors are coming from the first language interference. Okay, but then Richard in 1971, he actually challenged this popular belief, and he said that there can be other sources other than interference from the first language. Errors can be committed, or errors can come from the other sources. It's just not the sole reason. L1 interference is just not the sole reason, right? There are certain limitations we might be doing in detail, but many of these studies are cross-sectional. And if you remember yesterday's lecture, cross-sectional data collection is just one-time data collection. Okay. So such data collection or such studies can be faulty because they could not find out much in a single go, right? But studies of greater interest in second language acquisition are longitudinal studies of learners' error, because they show areas in which errors exist over time, right? Longitudinal studies are better and should be conducted for error analysis, for the reason that when the data is collected over a period of time, and as a researcher, you have a chance to visit your research site a number of times, so you can find out where are the problem areas, and why certain errors are repeated again and again, and where are the improvement areas. So related to a longitudinal study, we have an example here. Okay, so I'm just reading this out for you, just to tell you about longitudinal study, which was conducted by Chemotz in 1978. The study of the acquisition of English by a bilingual French-Spanish boy is interesting in this respect. He found that the main linguistic problem areas were omission of constituents, verb forms, sentences, formation articles, and prepositions. In some of these, the number of errors reduced sharply over a 44-month period, while in others, for example, question formation, little improvement was evident. In all these areas, however, there was considerable fluctuation in error frequency throughout the period. Chemott's study suggests that it may be difficult to provide a satisfactory description of learners' L2 development by quantifying the types of errors they make, right? So I'm just giving you an example of a longitudinal study, because this study took almost 44 months period, right? So it was based on years of data collection and years of making the corpus. So what happened is that the researcher could find out the repetitive errors and the improvement areas as well. Okay, so other than that, there is an other taxonomy which is quite popular, and you will find it in many of the SLA books, where they have categorized the errors. Okay, for instance, this taxonomy that is visible on the screen on table 2.2 on page number 56 is about the surface strategy taxonomy of errors, right? And they have categorized errors into 4 kinds. One is the error of omission, and then omission means when there is an absence of an item. For instance, I done it, right? So an auxiliary like have has been omitted here. I have done it. Instead, If the learner produces this structure, I done it. Or here, as you can see the example, she's sleeping. So is missing here. So omission refers to the absence of an item that must appear in a well-formed utterance. Then there can be errors of addition when something extra is added which is not needed there. For instance, you have heard so many people saying I means. Okay, instead of saying I mean, they say I means, adding an extra s to it. Okay. Here addition, you can see the example. We did not went there. Actually, it's a problem here. But the example that I have given you is more appropriate when just a phoneme is added and something that is not needed is added there. Then there's a category of misinformation where the use of wrong form of the phoneme or the structure. For instance, when it comes to making the second form or the past tense of irregular verbs, then these errors are very, very common. For example, the dog ate the chicken. Okay. So this comes in misinformation. And then misordering are the errors in the syntax or the syntactic structure. What daddy is doing, what is daddy doing? See, all the items are present here, but they are not properly ordered. They are misordered. Okay. So is would come here. What is daddy doing? What daddy is doing. So the teacher can understand this, but it happens to be according to the taxonomy that is developed here by Dewey, Bird, and Krushen. So, and this is called a surface strategy taxonomy. So there are 4 categories. So according to, what I'm trying to tell you that the teacher can get the meaning, but actually it's an error. For accurate use of language, these small errors needs to be corrected. Okay. So Quarter also gave a framework for describing errors. For instance, he divides it into 3. He says that, and then that's another taxonomy that we are discussing. There are a number of taxonomies, and we have discussed almost 3 to 4 taxonomies here. So Quarter again gave one more taxonomy, and that seems more promising also, because it reasons why a certain error has been committed. So he says that there are 3 categories. There are pre-systematic errors, which happens when the learner does not know why a certain form is used. Okay. And then there are systematic errors, and those when the learners cannot correct, but he knows the rules. He cannot correct himself, but he knows the rules. And in pre-systematic errors, the learner does not know the rule at all. And in post-systematic error, he can explain the rule, but he is inconsistent in use. Sometimes he uses the correct structure, and sometimes he uses the incorrect structure. Now, see how difficult it can be if a writing or written corpus comes in front of you, for instance, a composition writing, and in the first paragraph, the learner has used the correct form, and in the second paragraph, he has used the incorrect form, and then after a few lines, he has again used the correct form. So, it becomes difficult for the teacher or for error analyst to find out if he does not know the rule at all, or if he knows the rule, he forgets it, or he is working with some guesswork, right? So that's why, Quarter gives a framework for describing errors, and he reasons um, that why certain errors would be committed, and on the basis of those reasons, those should be categorized as pre-systematic when that's very apparent that the learner does not have the knowledge of the rule and he has committed error. Then there are systematic errors which the learner cannot correct, but he knows the rules. He cannot apply the rule, but he knows the rule. And then in post-systematic error, learner is inconsistent with the use. Sometimes he's using the correct structures, and at other times he's not using the correct structures. Okay. Now, I think I need to make another video for the last process, evaluation of errors, because the time would be over for the recording in a short while. So we are left with the last stage, I guess, that's evaluation of errors, and along with that we can cover the limitation of error analysis. I hope you have understood the identification of errors and the description of errors. Okay. What I would like you to do is to go through whatever we have done till now uh, from the book also. Read this chapter in detail for more examples, for more taxonomies, for a better understanding. Okay. I'll see you in the next video where we would be covering the last few topics related to error analysis, which is evaluation of error and limitation in error analysis. It would be a short lecture.